Okay, today my guest is Professor David Collis. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about David as a person. Professor Collis is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Collis is a fellow of the International Academy of Management. He is an expert on corporate strategy and global competition. He co-authored or authored several best-selling books on international strategy and corporate headquarters. Is the winner of the 50th Anniversary McKinsey Award for the best article in Harvard Business Review in 2008. His work has been frequently published in Harvard Business Review, Academy of Management Journal, Strategic Management Journal, among others. He has written over 100 cases and articles. He was recognized as HBR's best-selling author in 2010, with over 250,000 reprints sold. In 2012, HBR ranked his paper with Cynthia Montgomery as one of the top 25 most cited articles of all time. David was also recognized as one of the top 100 most influential textbook authors by the Academy of Management, Learning and Education. Thank you, David, for joining us.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
David, what did you want to become when you were a child?
A number of different things. I probably started out wanting to be a farmer. My mother's family were farmers. My uncle used to go on holiday to the farm, so a farmer, then a physicist. And then as I sort of migrated from maths to physics to economics, that's when I began to think more about sort of business strategy and so on. But the truth is my father was an academic. He was a professor at Birmingham University. So in the background, there was always, I'm going to be an academic.
So you grew up in England?
In Birmingham, yeah.
Okay. And what was the first earliest moment of awareness between foreign versus domestic for you?
When I was 9 years old, we began to go summer holidays in Europe. And probably the first thing I remember is policemen were called gendarmes. And somehow, that's, I'm not a linguist at all, but I began to think of the policemen as gendarmes. I didn't think of them as policemen, they were gendarmes. And that to me was sort of beginning to understand the world through another perspective. And so it was 9 years old, traveling around France.
And how did you choose academia?
Again, because my father was a professor. In the background, I think I always knew I sort of wanted to be one. But I'll be honest, if you do well at school, there's a little bit of an escalator like this. It's not that difficult. I did well at school. I went to Cambridge. I did well at Cambridge. I came to Harvard. You don't have to struggle to choose to do it. It's sort of a path that's relatively easy to take.
And how did you choose this particular field in strategy, IB, focusing on competition? How did you choose this particular area?
Well, except I do, I'm a strategy person. But what happened to me is I lucked out in that I was here at the Harvard Business School in the late 70s when Mike Porter was just beginning to do all the original work that became competitive strategy and competitive advantage. And I went to work at BCG in London in the late 70s, early 80s. So I just lucked out. I hit the very beginning of strategy as the strategy field. So I've done a whole lot of stuff. I mean, within that, yes, I've done corporate and global strategy. Why did I end up focusing there? There are a lot of people doing core strategy, business unit, competitive strategy stuff. And I was more drawn to the complexities of creating value across businesses, across geographies. And then again, of course, because I'm English and I'm in American context, I'm by definition international. I've worked in Europe, I've worked in South Africa. So I have I don't want to say cosmopolitan, but I have the interest in that. And those things conspired to lead me down a path of, both corporate and global international strategy.
Interesting. Something that is not on your CV, but people might find interesting.
I made a note here. What did I say? Oh, yes. Back to being cosmopolitan. Yeah, my wife is from New Zealand. My daughter-in-law is from Japan. So I sort of come from, or have built, or around me has come a very cosmopolitan family. So I think that's not apparent in my CV because it's family related, but that's an important part of who I am, what I am.
If you stop doing what you're doing today, what would you do? What's the second best alternative career path for you?
At one time, this is when I was leaving the Boston Consulting Group and coming back to do a PhD at Harvard. I did think about going into business, becoming a manager. That's a little bit like an alternative universe. I would have gone in a completely different direction. It's not that I regret it because I enjoy what I do, but that would have been an alternative path. It's too late now, I think. Well, it is too late for me to do it, but that would have plausibly, and again, I don't know how good I would have been as a manager, but I did sort of consider, let me actually go and do these things rather than just talk about them and research them, take accountability, take responsibility, actually show you can do this stuff. But I never did it.
No, it's not too late. Christos Pitelis, in his interview, he talks about thinking of doing a cafe. Why not? What would you do? What would you manage?
Back then, this is like 30 years ago, it was, I don't know who did I talk to? I talked to British Oxygen. That was about the one company I did. Since then, some opportunities have come up. I think the next question is about regrets or something. I turned down a job offer at Apple in about 2006. And had I done that, of course, I'd be a lot wealthier than I am now. But yeah, I never really it was a consideration, but I never seriously thought about it.
Well, it's not a regret thing, though. At the time, it was a great decision to stay, obviously.
It's not a regret. One can only do one thing with one's life, really. You can't do everything. Have a nice and appealing, it might have been. And again, I don't know whether I'm any good at it, but you can't do everything. You have to make some choices, and no regrets. No, because I've absolutely loved what I've done. It's just that there was an alternative universe where maybe I could have done that. Yeah.
But Apple, that would be something. That would be. About failure, what was your biggest failure and what did you learn from it?
The biggest failure is I didn't get tenure at Harvard. I came up for tenure. I was denied tenure. What did I learn from it? You just keep going with what you do. So I went down to Yale for 5 years, and then I was invited to come back to Harvard, and I've been here for the last, 20 years. At the time when you don't get tenure, it's pretty upsetting. But no, I've spent the last 20 years of my life here. And just keep going, I think, is the lesson. If you enjoy what you're doing, why not? But keep going.
What are you most passionate about?
Sorry?
What are you most passionate about?
What I'm most passionate about? That's tougher. I'm British. British people don't get passionate about much. The one thing I was thinking about a little bit is, and I hate to say sort of criticism of Americans. I don't know what percentage of Americans have passports, but the two things I find a little bit frustrating, not so much obviously in the Harvard community and so on, but America writ large, and is, no sense of history, no sense of, geography in some sense, that, they really don't have a broader awareness of where we've come from, how different people look at the world differently. And I think that's a real problem for, in this country, in America, that I wish Americans had more of a perspective about the world and history. That's something, not that I do much about it, but that's something I do think is problematic in America.
True. David, before we started recording, we were talking like a chit chat. And I told you you communicate very well. How I would like to talk about some research now. How do you explain your research? How do you explain the importance of your research to people who don't read your work regularly? Or how do you, and then later on, how do you communicate with these managers, and how do you write these HBR papers that are so clear, so crisp?
Okay, two slightly different questions. Yeah, you know, if I was, again, because I think what I've done is corporate and global strategy. So if I think what's sort of the value of that, one level I would talk about, it's that I help people understand how to create value across markets. You know, whether this is diversification, creating value across businesses, or international global strategy, how do we create value across countries, across geographies? That's sort of the principle of what I think I have done. Why do I think it matters to people? You know, particularly if you take the global one, you know, it brings benefits. So that, you know, if we think about people in in an emerging market, what does global strategy do for you? It brings you access to products or services you would not otherwise have had. You know, that's what the multinationals can bring into your country. And at the same time, it potentially offers you, you know, jobs. You know, if they build a facility there, or as they build their infrastructure in your country. So it's not just creating value for shareholders, creating that, you know, social welfare. You as an individual are better off in, again, you know, someone in an emerging market, because you have access to products or services you wouldn't otherwise have, because you have access to jobs, careers you wouldn't otherwise have had. So that's sort of the value, I think, of hopefully what I'm doing. The other question about the communication, that's slightly different. That I think comes from starting from the perspective, you ask about HBR and sort of practitioners, and they are a different audience than other academics. And so I do think the way you have success, if I can say I have any success there, is by starting from what's the problem they're addressing. And that is not necessarily an academic question. And that's what requires you to be out and about talking with executives. And, you know, plug for the Harvard Business School. That's sort of the comparative advantage of the Harvard Business School. You know, the fact that we start from practitioner related problems, we have access to practitioners and companies. And so that's where you begin. You know, what are the issues they're wrestling with, and how can you help them? Rather than here's an academic discipline and a subject, and, you know, it's getting narrower and narrower. How can I move it the next step forwards? That, to be honest, is not how you have success with a practitioner audience.
Let's just tie that thing to IB research, formal IB research. Things that we have neglected, areas we have not covered enough, omitted variables. In IB research, what can you say about that?
Yeah, omitted variables. Do you know, I mean, I think the issue with IB research is not so much omitted variables. I mean, it is, what's the problem you're trying to address? You know, back to what I was just saying, the motivation. What is it you're trying to study in the first place, rather than exactly how you're trying to study it. You know, again, sort of a little bit, you know, when we're talking to people about the advantage and the perspective and the difference between the Harvard Business School and elsewhere, it's because I've taught at Columbia and Yale, and you know, I think what tends to happen, unfortunately, in academia is you get trained up on a methodology and, you know, within a discipline. And, you know, that's the tool you then take, and you sort of somehow try and find a problem where applying that methodology gets you an academic publication. And to me, that's the wrong way around, you know, and that's sort of what's missing a bit in IB. Again, back to what I said before, rather than that, you start from what's the problem? What are the issues that managers, multinational are facing? And then you go back and you say, what's a methodology or a toolbox or an approach that will actually help solve that problem? So rather than working from the methodology, in search of a problem, I can find a publication. You start with the problem and you work back and you say, oh, what of all the different techniques and methodologies would be the one that's most useful for helping solve? It might be a survey, it might be an empirical, whatever it is, but you work back from the problem rather than forwards from the methodology. And that would be my critique more than, oh no, we're missing this omitted variable or that omitted variable.
Okay, let me follow up on that one. What are some of the problems that are being discussed now in the practitioner side that are not really coming or trickling down to the research side?
To the
that
research.
Will be for the next 5 to 10 years, maybe these will be fruitful areas of research. What can you say about that?
Again, I have the direct answer of you, and then the sort of more indirect one, which is sort of what I'm trying to do. The direct one is, I don't know, I'm just like this morning, last couple of days, I've been talking with executives at one of the very big Chinese companies about the issues they're facing. So what are they doing, global strategy wise? It's one where they're trying to build a brand. They've been very successful OEM. Now they're trying to, as an emerging market multinational, create a brand. That's an interesting set of questions. We sort of had the Japanese who did it, the Samsungs have done it. But, particularly when we see the emerging, multinationals coming from emerging markets, the question of how they build a brand rather than just capitalize on their low labor cost or arbitrage and advantage from their home country. That's an interesting question. They're wrestling with issues of global organization. Again, ones we've talked about in the past, what is the appropriate organization design here? That's rather dropped out of the IB literature, I think. And then what else? Digital transformation, which is more general than IB related. But that's one of the big issues that they're, how do we incorporate DTC into the traditional retail? How do we build omni-channel? And, those are current for them, obviously, in China. It's more complicated when you add in, we've got to do it around the world. So those are some of the things that we're talking about. When it comes to me and to my sort of, I'll be honest, I've done corporate, I've done global. What I think I'm trying to do, or a few of us here are trying to unify both of those. Why? Because they're addressing exactly the same question, which is ultimately how do you create value across markets, whether a market is a business or a country. And a lot of the issues are exactly the same. And yet the two don't really speak to each other very much. Organization design, there's a big literature in IB around subsidiary. In the old days, there was a big literature in centralization, decentralization of corporate strategies. That's one example of where, there are parallel research streams that have not quite been unified or shared enough. So that happens to be the one I'm thinking about a lot right now, which is how can we unify, or that's too ambitious. What can we arbitrage from one literature to the other literature? Some of the most successful work has been arbitrage, like Mike Porter was arbitrage. He took industrial organization economics and arbitraged it into the strategy field. So there's, I think, some opportunity to arbitrage corporate strategy lessons into international and vice versa.
Sure. About I asked this question to many of my guests. There's this group of people who believe globalization is going to be continuing, and another camp is saying, well, actually, it is the populism and the nationalism which is going to be taking over most of the parts of the globe. But what's your take on it? What's the evolution, in your opinion? Where are we evolving into?
I don't know. I'm not a prognosticator, certainly in the short term. On the other hand, going back to my perspective, so historical perspective, I mean, you know how, we only surpassed degrees of global integration from before the First World War in like the late 70s or something. We've gone through cycles. There was again, very different sort of globalization, colonialism and so on. Before the First World War, there was that horrible period, in the Great Depression and protectionism in the 30s, then the growth again after the Second World War. And we're currently in, a little bit of, some downturn and some, as you say, regression, I would say, to protectionism and so on, nationalism. On the other hand, we never went, and Pankaj Ghemawat was very big on this, we never went very far in complete globalization. His view of the semi-globalized world, where he had at one time the 10% presumption, this wonderful little piece where he had, if you look, defined, complete integration as 100%. So what would be complete integration? For something like students at the Harvard Business School, it would be the class composition represents just the population composition around the world. And he looked at a number of those sorts of variables and argued it was roughly 10%, even in the heyday, even in the peak of globalization. So we never got really completely integrated anyway. And if you look at the sweep of history and these cycles, my guess would be, we might be in a bit of a downturn, but if you take a 20-year perspective, we'll go back again, and there's still a lot more integration, globalization to go. And I would certainly hope that's the case. I would hope that's the case, even if I can't predict it.
Thank you. Who was your advisor when you were going through the PhD program? Program?
I was really lucky. As I said, I went through the early stages. Specifically, I had Dick Caves, who was, he wrote one of the very original books on multinational enterprise and economy. And he was a mentor to a very large number of PhD students, Dick Caves. I had Mike Spence, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. I had Mike Porter, who I suspect everyone listening knows, and I had Pankaj Ghemawat. So could I have had a better suite of PhD advisors? Absolutely not. I mean, each one of those is, phenomenal. Yeah.
And what was the best advice you received from them?
That's what the best advice I received from them. I don't know. I wasn't a very good PhD student as part of the problem. I'm not a great academic is what it comes down to. I had an RA here called Toby Stewart, who's now an incredibly successful academic. He tenure at Chicago, Columbia, here, Berkeley now, and hopefully coming back to us at Harvard. And I always remember telling Toby when he was my RA, don't look at what I do. I'm not a good academic. And sort of, why am I not a good academic? And this is, I think, a frustration of Dick Caves in particular. This is a reflection. I think I approached academia from the perspective of, I'll learn for myself. I'll understand how the world works for myself. And when you have that perspective, getting to academic publication and dotting the I's and crossing the T's and going through the revise and resubmit process and all of that is sort of not where you want to spend your time. You've already got it. Look, I get it. And then you want to move on to something else. And that is not a real academic. And so, I've had some, academic publications, but, I've not really been an academic in the traditional sense, which probably is why I didn't get tenure here originally. But I was always plowing my own path a little bit. you know, again, I lucked out, just that list of people: Mike Spencer, Nobel Prize in Economics; Mike Porter, probably the most cited person in the strategy field; Pankaj Ghemawat, huge contributor to both competitive and global strategy. And Dick Caves, who was the original economist who, looked at multinational enterprises. Just being with them, and catching the early wave. That's the secret of my success. Nothing I've done, and just through osmosis, being around them. I think that's nothing one particular piece of advice, but just being in that milieu.
Thank you. This was helpful. I mean, humility aside, you've done a lot. You accomplished a lot. But what are some of the things that you would say to junior faculty, PhD students all around the world about what not to do?
What not to do? A little bit, this gets back to what I said earlier. And this is my perspective. And again, you have to understand, this comes from someone who I don't think I'm a real academic. I've done a lot more sort of practitioner-oriented stuff, and whatever is 100 and something cases, which 95% are all field cases. I mean, I start from the problem and work back. So yeah, that sort of would be my advice. It's sort of unfortunate. It happens in any discipline, any research field over time. It gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. And it takes longer and longer. When I was doing my PhD, we got through in 3 years. Now a PhD is 6 years. It's you have to do it, obviously, if you want to be an academic, and you learn a lot, far more methodologically rigorous than I ever was or am, but don't lose sight of what you're trying to do at the end of the day, which I hope is yes, improve our understanding of the world, but use that to actually improve in some ways social welfare, improve performance, and never lose sight of at the end of the day. Yeah. And even an academic paper, I think, there should be some, even if it's not explicit in the academic paper, but there should be some greater purpose or value behind what you're trying to do here. It is so easy to get, well, not easy, but you go down this path of, I've got to get an academic publication out, and it's the publication that becomes an end in itself, not the lesson or anything. It's the, yes, there it is. I've got my, 4 or 5, whatever it is, good journal articles. Yeah, but what do they say? What do they contribute? What is, your question, if you showed it to the man in the street, what would they learn from this? Never lose sight of that.
Thank you. This was very informative. I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you.